Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who has joined this webinar from different parts of the world. The PMR welcomes you to another session of the PMR Perspective Series, Carbon Markets Across Latin America, Status and Outlook. Before we start, we will go over the housekeeping items for this event. Microphones will be muted for the duration of the event. If you cannot hear the speakers, please select audio settings and choose your preferred audio output. To select your language preference, please use the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. The chat option is going to be disabled. If you want to pose questions to panelists, please use the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen also. This webinar will be recorded and available for on-demand viewing on the PMR website. And once the event concludes, please select the leave button to exit. And now, I would like to welcome Ximena Aristizábal, our moderator for this session. Thank you.
Muy buenos días para todos. Me complace mucho estar con ustedes en una de las sesiones
Good
más.
morning. I am very happy to be in one of the most expected sessions of PMR, Actual Outlook and Outlook for Carbon Market in Latin America. I am going to repeat these instructions, but I'm going to repeat them in Spanish. And I want to remind you that you can listen either in English or in Spanish. The recommendations are that all microphones must be muted during the event. If you cannot hear the panelists, look for audio settings in your Zoom, and then you choose the audio configuration, and you can hear in the language you prefer by clicking on the icon that is like a world bottom right. Chat function will not be working. Questions should be placed in the Q&A icon chat that is marked by the Q&A icon. To leave, it will be recorded. You can find the recording in our webpage, and to leave, you just click the red button. We have a wonderful panel today who will be sharing with us progress, achievements in market instruments in the region. I invite you to listen to our panelists. You can ask all the questions you have and stay with us till the end of the event. I am Ximena Aristizábal. I'm Global Coordinator of the program in the Green Route Institute. DAPA is the design of policies for the Paris Agreement. I will be the moderator, and I will be presenting each of the panelists, and also will be managing the questions. I would like to thank PMR for the invitation, and thus we formally begin our session. For welcome remarks, we have Stephanie Gill. She is a manager for practices in Latin America and the Caribbean for energy and extractives in the World Bank. She manages all the energy commitments, regulatory reforms, disruptive technologies, new financing architecture, and other operations in the regions. You may have heard her because she was a supervisor of the many of the PMR programs in the region. It's an honor to be with you today. Stephanie, you have the floor. Thank you, Ximena.
To all our panelists and participants. And together with my colleague Marcos Castro, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this discussion as part of the PMR Perspective series. Today, we will focus on the status and outlook of carbon markets across Latin America. As you know, all countries in LAC face enormous negative consequences from climate change. Climate variability, extreme events are already disrupting lives and livelihoods, hitting the poor the hardest. We estimate that by 2050, if no action is taken, there will be more than 17 million internal climate migrants in LAC. That is 2% of the region's population. Currently, the sectors that produce most greenhouse gas emissions in LAC are the energy sector, and this includes, of course, electricity generation, but also energy emissions from transport, as well as energy used in industrial processes, manufacturing, and buildings. This is almost half of all emissions. Agriculture, then, including livestock, with 25% of all emissions, and land use change, and forestry, with 21%. The COVID-19 pandemic and the associated economic crisis have ravaged the LAC region, leading to a contraction of GDP of 7.4% on average, with some countries impacted much harder in 2020, and reversing the progress in reducing poverty that had been achieved over the previous decades. This brings into even sharper relief the imperative for the post-COVID recovery to be green, resilient, and inclusive. So while the priority is to put an end to the health crisis, a critical question is how government can best support a sustainable recovery. We should not aim at going back to normal. A recovery that locks societies into a high carbon pathway would make us more vulnerable to future climate change risks, including health crises, and make it costlier to reverse and reduce emissions later. In this context, carbon pricing instruments can constitute critical mechanisms to support a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. Carbon pricing instruments can help countries meet their NDC commitments, implement a post-COVID-19 recovery by boosting consumption and boosting clean investments with high job multiplier effects, and decarbonize their economies, even in a fiscally constrained environment. For example, in 2019, governments worldwide raised more than $45 billion in revenues from carbon pricing. Such revenues could be used to support such a green and sustainable recovery and make society less vulnerable to climate, ecological, and public health risks. Imposing a price on carbon could also further incentivize private sector participation into low carbon investments. The LAC region has been a leader in decarbonization globally. In the context of the challenges imposed by climate change, it can and it must really further its leadership role, for instance, through carbon pricing instruments and carbon markets. Putting a price on carbon can be part of the policy package to help the region transition to net zero emissions in the future. The region's commitment to decarbonization and its leadership role is also demonstrated by the fact that LAC countries represented a third of all countries participating in the PMR. And in this context, it is my true pleasure to welcome 4 leading countries in the region which participated in the PMR to share their programs, share the challenges they encountered, and the lessons they learned. Therefore, please join me in warmly welcoming a very distinguished panel. Mr. Marco Heredia, the General Director for Climate Change Policy at Semarnat in Mexico, Mrs. Milagros Sandoval, Director of Climate Change Mitigation at the Ministry of Environment in Peru, Ms. Carolina Diaz, Deputy Director of Disaster Risk Management and Climate Change at the National Planning Department in Colombia, and Laura Mora, Coordinator of the Programa País, Carbono, Neutralidad at the Ministry of Energy and Environment in Costa Rica. Como lo anunciamos previamente, en respuesta al gran interés que ha despertado.
As we said before, because of the interest in the region, the panel is bilingual and we have simultaneous interpretation. I am going to give the floor to Ximena Aristizábal, of the regional PMR network, who will help us with the moderation of the panel. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for reminding us of the challenges of climate change and post-COVID recovery. I think it's very important and the perfect words to open this panel in the region. I am going to present Marcos Castro. He is in the World Bank carbon sector in the Secretariat of Partnership for Market Readiness, PMR, where he manages technical assistance, development capacity, financing mitigation of climate change, and pricing carbon in Latin America. He is well known. We've seen him every day in the operation of the different PMR programs in Latin America. And for me, it's a pleasure to introduce you, Marcos. You will be talking about the PMR in the region, what happened. You have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Ximena, for your warm words. Good morning, good afternoon to all participants. My presentation will be brief. I just want to share outlook of status and outlook of the carbon instruments in the region and a summary of what the countries are undertaking under the PMR in the last few years. in the region. You've seen these slides, and it gives you a general idea of the status on the use of carbon instruments globally. You have heard these numbers in 2020. In a few weeks, the numbers will be updated to see what happened this last year. And those who've been working in this issue for a few years, it's interesting to see the evolution of the penetration of these instruments, the trading of the carbon to support mitigation. We have more than 60 national, subnational jurisdictions that use price instruments, and half have used carbon taxes. Others have traded bonds, and most have used a mix of instruments for pricing. Globally, we have to underscore that more than 20% of global eh, gas emissions are under a control regime of prices and emission control prices for the emissions. And as Stephanie said, these instruments, according to their design, they generated income through taxes or through the bonds that are sold. And this has led to $45 billion in 2019. In spite of the crisis, that increased even more. Those resources are very welcome in programs for green growth. Next slide. Now, the region, we will be focusing on Latin America in this session. In North America, various subnational groups have emissions trading systems. In Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Argentina, who have price instruments. And we will hear later in the presentations that they're preparing or designing the trading of those emissions in the case of Colombia and Mexico. Next slide, please. In the countries that have price instruments that are operating, taxes, carbon taxes. We will be sharing this presentation and we're sharing these details with you, but in Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico, we're talking about taxes to fuel consumption. In Chile, it's slightly different. The emissions are taxed, and they've been operating for a few years. They have experience in that, and they're implementing not only flexible systems with carbon certificates to compensate the payment for taxes, like in Colombia, Mexico, and in the future, Chile as well, but also reassessing the sectoral coverage and the fuel coverage. And as I was saying, in these countries, they've had experience with different actors in society so that they could set up complementary systems to broaden coverage and contribute to attaining mitigation targets. Next slide. This is the use of price instruments in the region. But as you know, in the last few years through PMR, we've been working at a global level, supporting the creation of an enabling environment, building capacity to introduce these schemes and other price schemes, supporting the countries to access new carbon markets in the midterm. Globally, the image here And as Stephanie said in her welcoming words, we see that the region has a very important presence in the program supported by PMR. 8 countries participated in the readiness programs with different priorities, with different technical issues and components that were supported by the programs. Next slide. A very quick overview showing the variety of the work undertaken by the countries. For example, in Argentina, the focus was assessing and analyzing price instruments that are implicit, such as the feasibility of renewable energy, energy efficient certificate schemes, and supporting some elements to deepen the carbon tax analysis that they already have. Another country that focused its work in the analysis and modeling to inform decision makings about the selection and design of price instruments in the future was Brazil. The work, it was a very sophisticated and all-encompassing analysis of the whole economy in terms of the impact of pricing instruments and the type of instruments that could be considered in the following phase as decisions were made by policymakers in Chile and Colombia. And we're going to hear details in their presentation. Given the national context, they were more concrete. In Chile, they supported, once the carbon tax was introduced, they supported the implementation of this tax, focused on emissions, and they supported the MRV systems to operationalize it. And also they worked in the design of other complementary pricing instruments could be considered to support their policies for the mitigation of climate change. In Colombia, the work was focused on other price instruments, the trading of emissions as stated by the law of climate change, which aimed at supporting design options for the reduction of emissions, and the next phase will continue supporting this effort. Also, they developed a series of activities to support the architecture, MRV architecture, especially in elements that would make feasible price instruments for carbon in Colombia. Next. Costa Rica, Mexico, Peru, and Panama also were very diverse in their work. Costa Rica, as well as in Peru, they worked on the one hand supporting the development of the National Carbon Neutrality Program, the National Carbon Footprint Program, complemented by domestic offsets, which can in the next few years grow. Also, the development of the MRV architecture to support mitigation policies, including price systems, and also a modeling and analysis on the use of instruments prices, such as a tax to greenhouse emissions in transport and other sectors. In Mexico, given the national situation and the change in the climate change law, the PMR supported the preparation and then the launch of the pilot phase of the emissions trading system. It's a scheme that is fully operational in Mexico, and we will be seeing the details in this session.
As I was saying before, with Peru working on the issue of carbon, and something very similar to the work that we supported in the case of Panama, doing this baseline work to assess the use of the different pricing instruments to support the mitigation efforts, especially on energy, but also with some technical elements, so as to be able to have the appropriate architecture. Briefly, and to conclude, I'd like to point out the work done in some of the countries supporting the design and operation of these programs aimed at supporting the carbon footprint so as to get to net zero emissions. We've supported a regional group so as to promote these carbon footprint programs. We are working right now with 7 countries, and we are looking forward to continue to support these programs, and we'll hear more about this in this session. Now I'll give Ximena the floor. Thank you so much, Marcos. This was very interesting, and it is an interesting challenge, sharing with us everything that happened in the region in 8-10 minutes only. And this is a starting point for what will happen next in the session. Right now, we'll move on to the discussion panel with the representatives of 4 countries which have been very active, as Marcos and Stephanie have already mentioned. With regards to carbon markets, we have Costa Rica, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. They'll share their different experiences. In Costa Rica and Peru, we'll hear a bit about what they've done with voluntary markets and with very robust MRV instruments. In Colombia, what has to do with carbon taxes and the non-causation. And no causation is similar to a compensation mechanism or an offsetting mechanism. And Mexico will share their impacts with the emissions trading scheme. The questions you have, you can aim them to the specific persons in the panel through the Q&A box on Zoom. Please enter those questions there. The team will be gathering those questions and we'll address those questions to the members of the panel. I'd like to ask the members of the panel to help us by describing in general terms the work they've been doing in their country, which have been their landmarks, their achievements in the different activities they've undertaken. We'd also like to hear about the challenges and lessons learned for each of you. Finally, we'd like to hear about your next steps. Let's begin now with our regional tour with Laura Mora, who's an advisor at the Climate Change Directorate and working as an advisor to the Ministry of the Environment in Costa Rica. She coordinates the carbon neutrality program of the Ministry of Energy and the Environment in Costa Rica. Thank you so much, Laura, for being with us. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'd like to say thanks to the PMR team and the World Bank team. I'd like to share with you the work we've conducted with our carbon neutral country program in Costa Rica. This goes hand in hand with the support of the PMR project. And we were able to do several things that I will share with you in a very succinct fashion. I'd like to show you the framework within which this program works as a voluntary program so as to report actions undertaken by organizations, products, events with regards to climate action in the context of the national environmental policies. Next slide, please. The program is one of the main national policies in the country. Is within that policy, which is the 2019-2050 decarbonization plan, which includes certain specific activities linked to our carbon neutrality program. For example, what has to do with a carbon neutrality program for products. We've been working with significant progress. Besides, the program is part of our updated nationally determined contribution, NDC. This sets forth specific commitments for Costa Rica and for the program as such. And this will be an official reporting platform. Right now with our NDCs, this is the official reporting mechanism for the main emitters in the country. Next slide, please. And as I was saying before, our NDC, which was recently updated with a level of emission that was above what had been originally put forward. Well, this is part of our system of metrics regarding climate change. And you will see how these official mechanisms for reporting and data collection linked to climate action in Costa Rica are setting forth a series of commitments that go beyond the work we've been conducting with the program, so as to be able to set objectives and goals, science-based goals, and in line with our national plan, working also with the private sector, and for this to be in line with the national contribution. Next, please. As I said before, we've been also working with the national metric system for climate change with different collaboration processes with PMR. This has been significant. We have a monitoring and reporting platform. This is the official Costa Rican platform to generate information that will inform decision-making based on data and science. And it has certain very specific components regarding what has to do with mitigation, adaptation, and climate finances. This allows us to capture data, process them, provide reports, and then to share and visualize this information. This is an open platform. CINAMEC, this platform, with the work we've been conducting throughout time, has had progress. Now we have our national stock of emissions. We report this information, and we are working so that this can be done automatically. Next slide, please. We've worked for this inventory of emissions that we are providing. We also have adaptation and mitigation actions. We also have pilot projects, and we work to have climate markers to consider things such as climate financing and international cooperation projects to support the efforts by the country. So there's a series of actions being undertaken, and this is quite an advanced platform, and it is being continuously improved so as to achieve at a robust platform that will allow us to control and have access to all of this information, which will allow us to report based on our commitments in the framework of the Paris Agreement, but will also allow us to make informed decisions. Together with CINAMEC, our carbon neutrality program becomes a tool for reporting and for management for different organizations that are carrying out climate actions. This tool has been used for several years. It has quite an interesting level of maturity. And it has evolved, it has been improved, it is in line with national policies. And today we are taking further steps. Marcos was mentioning our work with the regional alliance with Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, Panama, the IPCC. We are trying to have this harmonization of criteria so as to be stronger as a region with these initiatives. We are also sharing part of the experience we've had with the program at the international level, collaborating as project leaders. We working also with ISO. So we are sharing the experience we have undertaken. And this is what is allowing us to develop roadmaps for our productive sectors, science-based with specific commitments of emissions reductions, always in line with our national policies. So this is a tool that is continuously improved. As I said before, this program is a mechanism that allows us to recognize the level of emissions and to manage them. Next, please. You can see the different participants and the different levels of seals that those involved receive. Briefly, we have a concept of carbon neutrality, which is defined in our national standard. As I said before, we're trying to promote this at the regional level. And we have developed a series of resources that are very relevant for the different categories and which are available to the public with participation guides, calculation tools, and other materials. Next, please. To wrap up, I'd like to share with you the results we've obtained with this official participation mechanism. Next, please. We have about 172 organizations which are taking part, 25 organizations with over 1,000 facilities. This is in 25 communities. We are throughout the country. Next, please. And we have some interesting data to report. I wanted to show you with this information that the program, even though maybe you can see that not so many organizations take part, 200, but you can see that the representation is very important regarding the level of emissions, about 10.8 million carbon dioxide equivalent emission tons. You can see that for 2008, and you can see the level of resources that the different organizations use for climate action and to undertake specific reduction actions. We cover large percentage of our country. And this is a country that, this is a program that is focused on raising awareness. And we've been able to create awareness against, we have been able to create awareness amongst many people in our population. And some of the final data we wanted to share with the reductions, the removal of carbon emissions. I can give you more information should you wish more detailed information. You can reach me at my contact information in the last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Laura. And I am so sorry for cutting you short. It is truly a challenge to share all of this information. This is not work that has been done 1 year. This has been going on for a while. So I love the way in which you presented it. I am certain we will have several questions because you had to speed up at the end. We'll have more time for you to share more information. Thank you. It will be my pleasure. Let's continue now with our regional tour. Let's go southwards. We are going to Peru. Milagros Sandoval, Director of Climate Change Mitigation at the Ministry of the Environment, will share with us what they've been doing. I'd like to share that Milagros leads the program Huella Peru and RENAME, which is the National Registry of Mitigation Measures, or the MRB system in Peru. Thank you, Milagros. We're looking forward to hearing you. Thank you so much, Ximena. Good morning, everyone from Lima. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the process and the experiences everyone is sharing. And I'd like to thank you too for the invitation to present our work. We'd like to share with you what we are doing to work on carbon neutrality and the way in which we look at the future in Peru and the discussions in these weeks with these carbon neutrality processes and how we are discussing our outlook in the country. Next, please. I believe we need to start at the beginning. We'd like to share with you the progress made in the country. As Marcos said, we've made important progress that we'd like to share. That is, of course, important. Let's begin with our institutional element, which is what we consider the comprehensive management of climate change. This has two components. First, we have the institutional aspect. Since 2018, we've had a framework law on climate change with its regulation for its implementation. What is important about this framework law? This is what set the necessary conditions to move forward on this process. This law sets forth the different mandates pertaining to climate change. This is an innovation for the country because it determines our priorities in the field of climate change, which in this case fall under the purview of the Ministry of the Environment, and it sets forth the institutional activities with subnational and local governments which become part of the process. Besides, it sets forth clearly the way in which different non-state actors become part of the management of climate change. Likewise, part of this set of regulations has a national strategy for climate change with a 2050 horizon.
Also actions, because we cannot just stay with the institutional part and the rules. We have to land all of this in processes that are clear, specifics to give legal security to all of these issues. In December 18 last year, we sent our NDC update. In Peru, we called it our climate challenge. And through the NDC, we increased our ambition from 30 to 40% for the um, um, gas reduction, greenhouse gas reduction. We also have to underscore, as Laura said, in Costa Rica, in Peru, we also have a monitoring system for mitigation and adaptation measures. The whole process, which is important, is focused on an implementation strategy, which is participative. It's called Let Us Talk, and it allows us to involve different actors in the different sectors, state actors, non-state actors, civil society, indigenous communities, all participating and giving them an important role in the discussion of these issues. Our processes are then multi-sectorial, multi-levels, and multi-actors. Next slide. We would like to begin by telling you about the national strategy vis-a-vis climate change towards 2050. This is what we would like to attain. We are updating the process. We began in February with its launch, and through these months, we are going through the participative process to receive contributions. We've had several meetings with several sectors, several state and non-state actors. We hope that by July, the process will be approved. But I have to underscore that what we see and what we discuss in terms of what we want to be in the future, the desired situation. The idea is to discuss in the country how we see the country in 2050 in terms of carbon neutrality. Our desire is to have a new carbon neutral country. And we are identifying tools that can support us in this process and will allow us to visualize and discuss with the different actors how we envisage our own country by the end of the century. Next slide. The system for the monitoring of adaptation and mitigation measures. And here I would like to say that this is the way in which we are approaching the system in an all-encompassing form, looking at mitigation systems. The MRV system has 5 tools to deal with it. We have the Peru carbon print, and I will talk about that, the carbon footprint, the info carbon platform to look at our national inventory of greenhouse emission gases, and also RENAME, which is the Institute for Mitigation, registering mitigation measures. All these elements are within our law, and this gives legal security and clarifies the issues in which we want to go forward, aligning them with the international guidelines that are being discussed and are being decided upon internationally. Next slide. The Peru carbon footprint tool, like in Costa Rica, this is a voluntary tool, but also it's a way in which we've managed to promote articulation and work with non-state actors, especially with the private sector. This carbon footprints promotes measurement of greenhouse gases in each of the organizations. The main objective is to reduce them, of course, and to bring the private sector to the country climate commitment. The footprint has 4 levels of recognition: measurement, verification, reduction, and neutralization. The tool was launched at the end of 2019, and in spite of the pandemic, we've seen that many actors, many organizations became interested in the process. We have 190 organizations who are reporting their emissions, and the number is growing. We hope to have 200 more. That is the target for this year. Next slide. The National Registry of Mitigation Measures. This tool helps us to give legal security because it establishes the processes that are related to the way in which we will collect, register, monitor, and manage the information in terms of progress of emissions reduction and the increase of the elimination of greenhouse gases. This registry is called RENAME. Next slide. And as I also said, we have InfoCarbon, the National Inventory of Greenhouse Gases. Next. This is the long-term strategy in terms of carbon neutrality. The strategy has 2 components: the National Adaptation Plan and options towards carbon neutrality. Next. In terms of next steps, and so that I can be within my time limit, one of our main objectives for July this year is conclude the update of the national strategy for climate change towards 2050. We hope in July it will be approved. It's an important challenge because it helps all Peruvians to discuss what we want in our future. This month, at the end of this month, we will publish the new inventory of greenhouse gases. We've progressed significantly vis-a-vis the IPCC guidelines of 2016, and we will also be preparing the inventory 2018. We know that all the tools can be perfected, can be improved, so we're making changes to the carbon footprint, Peru carbon footprints during these months. The year in which we've been applying it, we've received many comments, and we've seen the interest that actors have demonstrated. It's important to continue improving the tools in a continuous fashion to be able to give legal security in terms of the operation of the National Registry of Mitigation Measures. During this year, we'll be approving the operational guidelines, which are clear steps through which different actors can register measures linked to a reduction of emissions. And additionally, during the last few years, we've seen a lot of interest in the setting of carbon prices or a carbon tax. We've received many contributions and also legislative initiatives about this. As Ministry of the Environment, we believe this is important. It is also linked to the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and we hope that the discussion will continue so that in the following months to get a decision by the legislative on this issue. But this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Milagros. Really interesting. And thank you for reminding us of having robust legislation, then going to action, and then update instruments that all can be improved. And the work that you're doing in Peru is really interesting. And good luck with the issue of taxes. We'll be paying a lot of attention. Now we continue. We're still in South America. We have Carolina Diaz, Deputy Directors for Disaster Risk Management and Climate Change of the National Planning Department in Colombia. Carolina has attained important things in her management, incorporating risk criteria and climate in development planning, and has promoted climate financing and risk management, follow-up and evaluation. and also instruments for financial protection. Thank you, Carolina. You have the floor to tell us about the Colombian experience.
I'd like to send my regards to everyone who's listening to us, and especially our partners in Latin America who have already shared their experiences. Next slide, please. I'd like to specifically thank Marcos Castro at the Secretariat of the PMR and the World Bank for inviting us to this event to share Colombia's experience with the implementation of our carbon pricing tools and the way in which these tools are helping us reach our climate objectives. Everyone knows that Colombia is following a very ambitious path regarding our climate commitments. We are a developing country, and in terms of emissions, we represent less than 0.52% of world emissions, even though we have high vulnerability to climate change. This is a situation similar to what we observe in other countries in Latin America. Just like you, in December last year, we presented before the UNFCCC a decision of cutting our emissions by 51% to 2030. This is quite ambitious. In total, we have 196 metrics in our NDC. Some of them, 148 are mitigation goals, 30 are adaptation goals, and 18 are implementation means goals. And I'd like to discuss some of this because there you will find in this discussion our carbon pricing tools, the ones that are currently being implemented and the ones we are developing. Next, please. Basically, taking advantage of the time we have, I'd like to make reference to three mechanisms we have for carbon pricing. They are recent in the country. First, our carbon tax. This was our first economic tool for carbon pricing. This does not aim at having a tax collection impact. What it tries to do is internalize the cost of the emission of GHGs. This has been in effect since 2016. The second tool is a tax mechanism for the no causation of the tax. This promotes reductions or the removal of GHGs. And thirdly, through our climate change law from 2018, we get the legal framework to design the national policy for our emissions trading scheme. These tools are not isolated from our climate change management. As others have said, these are the means that will allow us to set forth the right conditions with a conducive environment to meeting our international commitments. I'd like to take advantage of the time we have to emphasize this. Regarding the carbon tax, it aims at reduce the use of, disincentivize the use of fossil fuels. This is done with the payment of a rate that is a levy on fossil fuels. This takes into account the amount of carbon dioxide in fossil fuels. And this rate is $4.68 per ton of emissions equivalent to carbon dioxide generated by these fuels. But it is important to remember that with the use of this tax, we are funding other activities, for example, what has to do with the environment. So here we have the possibility of strengthening what has to do the management of coastal erosion, and the protection of our strategic ecosystems. Our second instrument, as I said before, is what has to do with this no payment of the tax. This strengthens the voluntary carbon market. This helps us regarding forestry, energy, and GHG markets. We are channeling the participation of the private sector to prevent the emission of GHGs, but this has co-benefits to the extent that we are generating jobs, we are increasing ecosystemic benefits, and the impact of this mechanism since 2017 till December last year has been of about 39 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. This is a big achievement. Broadly speaking, we'd like to say that all of the actors in the value chain of fuels, including final end consumers, and everyone else interested in showing the reduction in the emission of gases, can be part of this mechanism following the different guidelines indicated by the regulator, which is under the purview of the Ministry of the Environment. And finally, we have the most recent mechanism, which has been decided, which is the emissions trading scheme. The regulator establishes a goal for a specific year, and the regulated actors have to regulate their emissions through the different emissions quotas. When we're talking about a quota, we are making reference to a tradable right, which allows the actor to issue 1 ton of carbon dioxide or the equivalent. We have the idea of having a pilot by 2024 with the operational stage in 2025. To wrap up, I have 2 important messages on this process. First, our roadmap to develop and implement our ETS was adopted in April at the Intersectoral Committee for Climate Change. This is at our highest level agency for climate change in the country. This shows the importance that this has for us. And we need to recognize that all of these mechanisms have been possible thanks to the Ministry of the Environment and Sustainable Development, which has been spearheading the process, and the articulated work between the Ministry of Finance and the National Department of Planning. Specifically, this last mechanism, the ETS, well, we've had strategic support through PMR Colombia, which has allowed us to address questions we had on design options, components, operation, and the articulation we have with other existing policies in the country. This has allowed us to make progress with the commitments the government has undertaken regarding climate matters. Ximena, this is it for now. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Carolina.
Now we're going to hear Dr. Marco Heredia. He is the General Director of Climate Change in the Secretariat of the Environment and National Resources in Mexico. He headed the design of the emission system. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you today, and you have the floor to tell us about what Mexico has been doing. Thank you, Ximena. Thank you, Marcos and the PMR team. It's an international initiative that's making an important difference in implementing mechanisms and instruments to establish carbon prices And we've seen very interesting results, especially Mexico allows us to see the path forward. And I would like to thank you all and thank you who participated in this process. You participated in all the phases of the program. We begin. Thank you for the opportunity. We begin our presentation. Let me give you a broad perspective that will show us why, for next slide, for Mexico, it's important to establish carbon prices. Next slide. Also a policy, a climate policy that is very active that will allow us to have a very strong action vis-a-vis climate change. Can we see the next slide, please? We are very vulnerable to climate change, not only because of our geographic position, but also because the social and environmental conditions. We are between two oceans, as you know very well. But let me underscore it as one of the basic points. We cannot forget that when we look at the actions undertaken vis-a-vis climate change, we have an important island surface, more important than the land mass, if we include the exclusive economic zone that allows us to act in a very firm actions against these effects. Next slide. Our emissions, next, are 734 million tons. Next slide, please. And as we said at the beginning, an important part is the use of energy through fossil fuels to generate energy for the transformation of goods and services, transport. So that's where the emissions come from. This is the large screen showing where climate actions are centered. Next slide. We also have an institutional framework that's very robust, implemented in 2012. And this implementation meant the establishment of an Intersecretariat Commission, Climate Change Commission, participation of the states, Congress, municipalities, and institutes that generate science and integrates all the knowledge for decision makers and a process of policy evaluation. Next slide. The institutional framework is aligned with a national development plan, a general law of climate change in force since 2012, and an NDC established with limits established in 2015, but which are incorporated in the legislation in 2018. And in 2018, we were able to establish limits throughout the different sectors that generate emissions and also black carbon emissions. Next. So our NDC is 22% reduction until 2030, but a broader perspective when there are mechanisms, there are elements that fix price, carbon prices, as we're talking today. And this allows us to act given the challenge of climate change. The NDC, therefore, responds to a better knowledge of climate change, the vulnerabilities, the sources, and also those who contribute to emissions, and also includes gender issues, human rights, and identify synergies between mitigation and adaptation, linking them to the ODS of the Sustainable Development Goals. What we've seen next, what we see is that we've been implementing the NDC linked to the national policy tools. What we seek is to lay the foundations for a resilient economy, low carbon, with the participation of elements that not necessarily would be included in an emission trading market, but benefit from a perspective and offsetting programs. Next, how do we do that? We try to integrate principles of climate policies, seeking fair transitions, seeking justice in climate so that all benefit from the schemes. As we changed the law in 2018, we allowed us to establish the emissions trading system as a mechanism to help us integrate fiscal, financial, market variables so that we can better distribute the onus, the weight on the costs of adaptation and mitigation. The law includes several mechanisms: fiscal, financial, as we said, and market systems. And it's very important to say that Mexico, as we see in the next slide, has a carbon tax, and that carbon tax has been in force since 2014, and we've collected 45,000 million pesos, about $2 billion. And I believe that it's very important to say this: the carbon price
considers or is part of this carbon tax. We've had this experience, as you can see, were able to see in the chart that Marco was showing us at the beginning. We can see what it looks like and that the way in which it could improve this tax collection effort in the context of the pandemic, giving more fiscal space for a green recovery and a sustainable recovery. Next. At present, Mexico has implemented this first emissions trading scheme in the region with a pilot. We are now going through the allocation coverage of the ETS based off 100,000 tons of direct emissions of carbon dioxide from fixed sources. This is important because the electrical sector includes 16 subsectors with emission of GHGs. We are having free allocations. We are doing verifications, and based on that, there is a free of charge allocation. This so as to be able to determine these allocations. There is surveillance and compliance. There is a process in which we are working with the authorities in charge of verification. And we are thinking about the use of flexible compliance mechanisms. The test program started January 1st, 2020. And we will have it in effect for a couple of years, and then we'll have a transition period from January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2022. And the operational stage will start in 2023. This means that we will have transactions and the market of these emissions trading scheme using the different offsetting protocols with real operation or functioning. Next, please. Just 1 minute you have. I have 2 more slides. I wanted to share with you the way in which this ETS has been working, and with the beginning of the test program, we are now in the process of verifying the emissions. We are implementing a registry, as you will see in the next slide. PMR has been a huge help in the initial studies. It has allowed us to get a clearer idea of the different elements, that the allocations, the actions by the authority, and these emission rights, incorporating the main actors so as to, well, I don't want to say educate them, but to train them in the use of this system and the use of the platform, so as to be able to support the work of the industry and our own efforts as authorities in charge of the system. Then we have the follow-up system. It's known as registry. This is the platform to exchange allocations and the movements in the ETS. This will allow us to have accounting, also transparency, a good management of data with all the IT security that this requires, in such a way that this will allow us to do a timely, transparent, and effective management of the ETS, so as to have the appropriate accounts with dashboards, with participants that have been very clearly determined, with very clear accounting. Next steps. We will guarantee a reporting and verification mechanisms that work in an optimal fashion to move to a system where we can guarantee the compliance mechanisms. All of these elements that will be so useful in the system, like the auctions. We'll need to fine-tune the system, review the maximum levels. We'll need to review the functioning of the different actors, verifiers, businesses, our own factions as authorities. Also the allocation methodology, the follow-up system. We'll need to clarify the nature of each of these systems. With this, I conclude my presentation, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marco. I also have the feeling that we need more time. Mexico's experience is very relevant. Thank you for talking about the carbon tax and the institutional arrangements. Mexico has both instruments under implementation, so I bet you'll have several questions. We will tackle those in just a moment. Now we'll have time to address the questions provided. For everyone listening, please ask your questions through the Q&A section on Zoom. What Carolina was saying was very interesting. The results of that tax, I believe that will be so important for Peru because they are getting started with that process. Also, what has to do with Colombia and their ETS. Here we can see the different strategies each country is implementing and the different ways in which you have adopted these mechanisms. I'll ask everyone to please turn on your cameras and we will begin the Q&A session. I'll start with the order in which the questions, with the order in which you presented. So we'll begin with Laura. There's a question for Laura here. it's how do you know that total national emissions are of that level if so far only a small number of businesses have been reporting? Could you discuss that? Thank you for the question. I'm sorry, I was not able to explain that very well during the presentation, but Costa Rica, just like the rest of the countries, has its national inventory of emissions with different methodologies using macro data at the national level. We do not go with a bottom-up approach, but from the top to the bottom. We have this inventory of emissions. The most recent is from 2015, and this is where we obtained that information of over 10 million tons. And the comparison I was showing you is a way of showing that the national inventory has a little less than 10 million, and the emissions reported in the program are of about 2 million. So this shows that some of the main emitters in the country are part of the program. So even though in numbers we do not have so many organizations in the program, but we see that those who are there, some of them are some of the largest emitters. Thank you, Laura. I believe that has really made the issue of coverage much more clear. Milagros, let's move on to you. We have a question that has to do with the participation of Peru on the PMR. And they are asking, what have you done in the PMR so as to be able to move forward with the design and implementation of these instruments? Thank you, Ximena, and thank you for your question. The support of PMR has been essential because I believe that we have about two issues that are very important to highlight. First, we have the architecture or infrastructure of PMR, which MRV, which has allowed us to see the regulation that we need to follow for our laws. And as you know, in Latin America, we have so many standards and everything needs to be regulated in detail to have clear mandates. So this has helped us reflect on which are the needs pertaining to this architecture.
The other issue is an analysis to see if the Peruvian carbon price is feasible or not. No country is alike another. The economies are different, and we have to think about that to see which tools which are used in some countries are applicable to our countries. As you mentioned, in Colombia, in Mexico, in Chile, they have experiences that are important for us to see how it is that we make them feasible, looking at our national situation and also our legal framework. And PMR has really given us a lot of support in that. Thank you. Thank you, Milagros. You are right. We're all different, and the design of the tools has to reflect that difference. I do not see Marco Heredia in the screen, but I am going to ask a few questions to Carolina. I have several for you. The first question, it's general. What are the general guidelines of the national government for the roadmap for the emissions trading system? Thank you, Ximena. Can you hear me? Yes? Yes. I just wanted to make sure. Let me tell you that for the roadmap of the emissions trading system, we analyzed 4 aspects. The first is the role of the system vis-a-vis other climate change policies, and that's very important. And we had to analyze the interaction with the carbon tax, the non-causation system, methodologies to understand the projects that will be generated with the resources from the system. Also to understand what gases will be covered, how is it articulated with the offset system for the reduction and elimination of the GE, and also limits, how it is that quotas will be assigned. Are they being auctioned? Are they going to be free? And other secondary elements that are part of the design, such as the thresholds for the greenhouse gases, also conceptual frameworks for auction, stabilization of prices, and also a more operational analysis to determine the architecture, the institutional architectures. How do you report emissions? How do you monitor, report, and verify? And then understand that part of the Ministry of the Environment and developed a process to work with all key actors. And this is part of our roadmap. We need to have this very clear before we launch the pilot program for 2024, as I said before. Thank you, Carolina. It's a very difficult question to answer in a minute because there are too many things, but thank you for your good summary. We have a question for Milagros. What was the most difficult in the linking of the private sector in the carbon footprint process? It's a very good question, and that's something that we were discussing yesterday within the events that we've been holding this week. There are several challenges, especially linked to the strengthening of capabilities. Why is it important to measure, to manage the emissions by the companies? That was the first way in which we approached those challenges. That was what's most difficult. And I think that there are similar issues there in most of the countries. Issues of the carbon footprints are management indicators. And for that, we have to strengthen capabilities, do monitoring, follow up, support companies. But the companies, the private sector is very open. They're very interested in these processes. And this is being reflected in the numbers we're having of companies that are joining, not only one by one, but also associations of companies. For example, hotels associations that are thinking about what's coming up in the future. And that's interesting because this is not just in the country. This is being discussed in the world and in Latin America, of course. So those issues are important. Also awareness raising. We have a communication strategy that has helped us a lot, and that has helped us in the lessons learned vis-a-vis this process. Thank you. Thank you, Milagros. I think the same question could be asked to Laura in Costa Rica. I don't know if you want to add anything about your experience. It was the involvement of the private sector, how it worked for you, what was the challenge, and how you managed to do it. The challenge was interesting. When we launched the country program in Costa Rica, it was the motor was the private sector. They've always been a step forward vis-a-vis the government. They are very involved. They're very demanding in the generation of tools so they can participate in climate action plans. The program was very well received, and our main challenge right now, and looking at some of the questions that we saw in the chat, have to do how to generate added value so that we can develop an economic model that is profitable a decarbonized economy, but a growing economy at the same time. So we focused our efforts in improving the tools we have, like the carbon neutral country, generating economic incentives, non-economic incentives that are attractive and that will add a value to organizations and companies that participate. So the idea is to generate a win-win situation where a private sector entity will see the needs of the country and as a planet to reduce emissions. The challenges we identified are to show what they win as a company, what value does it add to their business, and we are trying to have a green economic growth that's decarbonized, but generating a mentality of economic benefits. We're constantly working on that, generating incentives that will support their participation. Thank you, Laura. We have 1 minute for our session. And really, it was very short, doubtlessly, but I've been told that all the other questions will be answered offline. So I will be sending them to you. I hope everybody will receive answers to their questions. If you didn't take notes during the events, PMR has a live streaming on what everything was recorded. So Fernanda will be sharing the results of this exercise. Fernanda has been taking notes during the session. She drew the notes, and we see the results in this slide. It's really impressive. Voluntary Costa Rican program, the emissions report, the resources that were needed for a reduction and compensation, and it reminds us of what Laura said about other instruments that can be linked to the emissions program. In Colombia, the issue of looking for instruments like carbon taxes and other legal instruments to de-incentivize the use of fossil fuels, finance measures, and channel the collection. Also in Peru, Milagros in a cloud showed us it's important to talk, to then act, to have a strong legal framework. The dialogue has to be multi-sectorial, multi-level, multi-actors. And finally, in Mexico, they're talking about policies the country implements in terms of carbon prices. And there are 134 million tons that have been covered and 45 billion pesos collected through the carbon tax. The resource can be used for climate justice for all. This is a very short summary, but these key words will remind us of what we heard from our presenters. We close the section with this. I would like to thank Stephanie, Marco, Laura, Milagros, Carolina, and Marco, who's not here any longer, but it was really interesting to hear your experience. And I will be sending you the questions that we were not able to answer. So very quickly, if you want to say goodbye, and I would like to thank you for your time.